This is the fourth workshop in a series hosted by the West Valley Action Network, Indigenous People for a Nuclear-Free Future. My name is Colleen Christich, and I work for Partnership for the Public Good, which is a community-based think tank in Buffalo, New York. PPG has partnered with the West Valley Action Network and the Western New York Environmental Alliance to host a series of these workshops. The West Valley Action Network formed as a loose association of individuals and groups in 2009 to work for the full cleanup of the West Valley nuclear waste site in West Valley, New York, Cattaraugus County, which drains north into Erie County and the Great Lakes. It is comprised of individuals and organizations in New York, the US, and Canada working for the full cleanup of the West Valley nuclear waste site and includes the Coalition on West Valley Nuclear Waste, Sierra Club, Western New York Environmental Alliance, Nuclear Information and Resource Service, Indigenous Women's Initiatives, Citizens Environmental Coalition, the Western New York Peace Center, WinCosh, Citizens Campaign for the Environment, NYPIRG, the Adirondack Mountain Club, religious groups, sporting groups, and many more. Other workshops from this series can be viewed on the Western New York Environmental Alliance website and will be placed in the chat. A few of the past workshops have been the history of the West Valley nuclear waste site, part 1 and action needed, digging deeper, the history of the West Valley nuclear waste site, part 2 and action needed, protections needed for Western New York during the demolition of the most radioactive building from the West Valley Action Network, and tonight's workshop on Indigenous People for a Nuclear-Free Future. Before we get started, it would be great if everyone could introduce themselves in the chat, your name, where you're joining from, and anything you're wondering about today's session. If you need closed captioning, there is a button at the bottom labeled CC. This workshop will feature Agnes Williams sharing Indigenous perspectives for a nuclear-free future. Agnes F Williams is a Wolf Clan enrolled Seneca Haudenosaunee Iroquois who was born and grew up downstream from the West Valley, New York nuclear waste site on the Cattaraugus Creek of the Seneca Nation of Indians near Irving, New York. She is a sister, auntie, grandmother of 8, and mother of 3 daughters. She lives on the Cattaraugus Creek, working in Buffalo, New York with the Indigenous Women's Initiatives, Indigenous Women's Network of Austin, Texas. She has attended the Thomas Indian School, Gowanda Central Class of '68, and received her 1972 bachelor's and 1973 master's from Syracuse University's School of Social Work. Agnes became a 1991 doctoral candidate in American Studies at the University of Buffalo. Her dissertation topic is the Retraditionalization of Indigenous Women as an Empowerment Strategy, and authored a 1978 paper for the National Education Institute in Washington, D.C., The Changing Roles of American Indian Women from the Reservation to an Urban Setting. As a licensed social worker, Agnes has clinically worked as a perinatal counselor, family therapist, field supervisor for social work students, and a child welfare consultant and training specialist. Currently, Agnes is a coordinator at the Indigenous Women's Initiative, campaigning for Water is Life, a nuclear-free future, and dismantling the doctrine of discovery. As an organizer and activist, she extends public invitations to join her work for peace and justice. Also tonight, Diane Dorigo of Nuclear Information and Resource Service, who presented in previous sessions, will also be facilitating today's session. To learn more about the current concerns of the West Valley Action Network, you can visit their website, which I will place in the chat, www.westvalleyaction.org. So without further ado, I will pass it to Agnes.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share some of what's been going on in the Cattaraugus Creek. These are our homelands. You know, we were put on the reservations. All of our original territory for the Haudenosaunee extended from the Hudson River Valley across the current New York State, Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec, and down to the Ohio River Valley at the height of our existence. As Indigenous people, you know, we were going extinct until 1900, and it's only been since a little over 100 years of physical recovery that we've become more active and kind of out there, where before that, we were suffering from the disease, war, removals, and genocidal policies that resulted from the boarding schools, the forced relocation onto reservations, as well as relocation into urban settings. And the historical trauma that has existed for Indigenous peoples is one of the factors in our life expectancy. Is 54 years old today. Used to be 45 back in the 60s, but we, last 50 years, we've only gained a couple of years on that. We continue to struggle in our communities to survive. And in the 20th century, and what we're going to talk about today here in Western New York, West Valley, as one of the industrial attacks upon Haudenosaunee territories across New York State and Canada. And it's the mid-century, we had the Kinzua Dam that took land from the Allegheny territory, flooded, created a reservoir, flooded, and for a power project, for electricity. And that dam never did really produce the power that was expected of it to produce. And today it's not even in operation anymore, and they're talking about taking it down. So there's the out in Allegheny, which is in the southern interior near Seneca, New York, for people that don't know. And then on our reservation, we had the West Valley nuclear plant that was upstream from us. That was again touted as an energy saving project, not for us, but basically for the first and second world. And it's kind of been the whole development paradigm that we exist in, that the development of the first and second world peoples is dependent upon the underdevelopment of workers, low wages, and no development for Indigenous people. And this is just another example of that occurred in the 20th century. So then we have the Robert Moses Power Project near Niagara Falls that again built a reservoir, took land from the Tuscaroras, displacing them and creating change that they're still struggling to survive from, as well as the Manhattan Project, which was nuclear waste that was stored on the reservation on True Road. And why they would even do that is unspeakable. And the road actually, bubbled up there, and people that lived on that road experienced defects and problems with their health. So from there we go east, and we come upon the Oswego, where there's 3 decaying nuclear plants there now that are still spewing radiation into Lake Ontario. And from there we can look to the Mohawk River in the Mohawk territory of the Knolls project that Charles Bowman gave us some insight into. I think it was in the second part of this series. And then you go farther up north on the St. Lawrence River, where the General Motors in the Alcoa plant dumped toxic waste chemicals into the St. Lawrence River, and also polluting the Akwesasne Reservation to the point that the breast milk of the Mohawk women was contaminated, and they were no longer able to breastfeed their children because of that. So in the 20th century, we were as the Haudenosaunee, we were kind of all focused on our own crises and our industrial disasters that we were living through. And it's only been more recently, the lawyer for the Confederacy, Joe Heath, has put out a red paper that has talked about not only the effects of nuclear in the Haudenosaunee territory, but in other territories as well. So we see that the nuclear chain, and then one of the myths that was created was that nuclear is a cycle, trying to kind of sell it to the people as something natural, and it's not. It's a chain. It has a definite beginning and has a definite end. And in the beginning, we can look across Indian territory, indigenous peoples' lands, and we can see the results of uranium mining. Most extensively in the plains. There was a spill in Edgemont in the 50s there that contaminated much of the water, the drinking water, and also in the Southwest. The mill tailings are still there in the Southwest, and the Navajo children play in those mill tailings. And the problem there has become so bad that the Navajos actually field their own Special Olympics now, because so many of the people have been affected by that uranium mining. When the uranium mines were shut down in the 1970s, much to the activism and efforts of one of our Indigenous Women Network leaders, Winona LaDuke Anishinaabe from White Earth, and she was in the Southwest and worked with many others to get those mines closed. And once they closed, then we just seen how the uranium mining companies, they moved from the reservations in the Southwest to the reservations in Saskatchewan, Canada, and to South Africa. So these are all examples of how Indigenous people, really have been targeted and chosen to become what we call a national sacrifice area for these types of industrial development and energy exploitation. And with none of that energy ever coming back to benefit. Many of the Navajo people don't have running water even. They still carry their own water, and they still live off of the land, they subsist. And this is why it is so significant for Indigenous people, because we live off the land still, that we are the first affected when the industrial toxics and the nuclear radiation poisoning is done from the mining and the waste disposal. The other example in the plains, I know in the 70s and the early 70s, the governors in the plains area met, and it's actually documented through, which we found out later, when through the Freedom of Information Act, that the governors would meet and decide where they were going to designate these national sacrifice areas. And the one area that was designated was the Badlands, because of the tectosite that was felt to be a natural insulator for the nuclides. And there were all these plans put together without the prior free consent of the indigenous Lakota, Nakota, Dakota people that were living on the land there. So in 1973, when the Oglala Band of the Lakota Nation, the Great Sioux Nation, declared themselves independent, the federal government reacted violently and extremely brought in weapons, tanks, and attacked the people that were occupying that land there. And come to find out years later, in 1975, after the shootout with Leonard Peltier and the FBI's and the Freedom of Information came back, that's when we saw that the real motivation of the government was to, because it had already been declared a national sacrifice area. And when the Oglala's refused or declared themselves as an independent nation, there was this extreme reaction to the nuclear development plans that were already in the hopper. So we can see that because indigenous people live on, the land and still occupy probably 70% back then. In last century, it was 70% of the natural resources in the United States, and I'm sure it's more in Canada. That there was this planned and deliberate way to sacrifice our health and well-being for the first development of the first and second world. Now, on the other end of the nuclear chain, like I said, there's the beginning and the end. There's a definite beginning and end. It's not a cycle, it's a chain. Is the waste disposal. And it's not only indigenous people, but other poor people of color have experienced, these kinds of pollutions in their communities and industrial waste that they've had to clean up here in Buffalo. We all have lived through in the last century of the steel mills and the pollution that it's created in the Great Lakes region, and how our Great Lakes, which are a unique source of fresh water to the world, because there's no place else in the world like it, were polluted and are still polluted. And, as we all struggle to continue this kind of cleanup. At that same time, 1964, and I have one of my distinguished colleagues is here today with us from the NIRS, Nuclear Information and Resource Service from Washington, D.C., and will be joining us to talk. We start talking more specifically about West Valley and what's going on at West Valley, and the struggle to clean up, to contain. One of the notions, I think, and the myths that were created last century was that dilution is the solution. So in many cases, you'll see the nuclear chain being acted out around waterways. And to the dismay of all of us today, who are buying our drinking water and thinking about, where are we going to get our fresh water to drink in the future for our future generations. These are very, very big concerns. So at West Valley, for me, at least as a Seneca person who lives along and grew up along the Cattaraugus Creek, I'm very concerned about the containment, and the development of the science to contain the nuclear waste and the whole process that the nuclear chain has taken people through. So in 1978, we became introduced to the Japanese, because at that time they came, the Buddhists in particular came to our territories to walk with us as we were protesting 11 pieces of anti-Indian legislation that were being introduced into Congress. And that had all started in the Northwest with the fishermen and the gaming people that like to go hunting. They didn't want to have the Indian to be fishing. And in the Northwest, it's all of us that are indigenous people, living off the land and living, most of us living by the waterways. This is how we've survived and we've subsisted for all of these years. And many of us, especially in the Northwest, were fishing. This is the way they fed their families, took care of one another, took care of themselves. And once the commercial fishing started along the coast, as well as the recreational fishing, there was a movement that started in the late 70s to terminate indigenous people, Native people from their what we call trust status, which is in legal Indian US law, when they call it Indian law, but it's really US law. There have been many laws that have been made around treaties. We have occupied this land before Columbus, BC, and we've been here for thousands of years. So in many cases, there were treaties and agreements made on how we were going to coexist. And the US law has really been developed itself for the Indian United States law for the non-Indians. And in that case, they were going to make this law to terminate in late 70s the status. And again, without prior free and informed consent. It's just kind of a thing people, along with name calling, and I said, well, we're just gonna do this on our side. We don't have to keep these agreements because, we want to do this or we want to do that. We want to pollute. We want to, get the fast buck, make money now and worry about pollution later. So unfortunately for all of us, pollution is here now. And it's a major concern for all of us with climate change and the rising temperatures, the fossil fuels, the carbon in the atmosphere, and our whole industrial way of life, has really brought us to the brink here of our own destruction. So as indigenous people, again, last century, we're all kind of calling this to people's attention, because as indigenous people, we were finally healthy enough, and we had stopped going extinct in 1900 and gotten well enough. Most of us were sent to boarding schools, which were then out of the boarding schools were relocated to urban areas. And so by the 1970s, most of the 70% of the Native population lived in urban areas, where just 10 years before, we were all living still in rural reservation areas. So you might say, well, what does this all have to do with West Valley and nuclear waste? Well, it really is part of the pattern, and it's part of the problem. And when we talk about looking for solutions, they told us back then, that dilution's a solution, for nuclear waste. And that just has not been proven so. And so we are currently in a state with challenges, great challenges to contain the nuclear waste that has already been produced by war and by weapons. And when I mentioned the Japanese before, because the Japanese are very concerned about no more war. And as we became acquainted with the issue of nuclear development, we brought to the table as an Indigenous people to broaden and to expand the anti-nuclear movement in the 60s and 70s to include nuclear development and waste disposal on native territories. So that's just a kind of a general overview of how, you know, we in our little corner of the world here at West Valley fit into this larger expansive thing that's been going on with nuclear development. And I've invited Diane DeRigo from the NIRS Nuclear Information and Resource Service to come and really, you know, our goal of doing these series are really to help people to become more active, first, more concerned about containment and about cleanup, and more concerned about our own health in terms of, you know, nuclear and how it's affecting us. So Diane, could you introduce yourself a little bit and talk a little bit about NIRS and how we started the Action Network?
Yes, my name is Diane DeRigo. I'm a chemist and a community organizer and a researcher for Nuclear Information and Resource Service. We're a nonprofit anti-nuclear power group, power and weapons, in the Washington, D.C. area on the unceded land of Piscataway, Nakachuk, Nacotchtank, and Anacostans and Nanachoke land. Nuclear Information and Resource Service has been around since the 1970s, assisting local people around the country, and actually we're a bit international as well, to fight nuclear power and replace nuclear power with safe renewable energy. And being originally from Western New York, West Valley is what got me interested in the nuclear issue. West Valley, the site, as our previous presentations of the West Valley Action Network have described, started out in the early 60s as a nuclear waste site that brought in high-level, low-level weapons, transuranic, commercial, all kinds of nuclear waste to be processed and buried. And we now are struggling decades later to prevent that from leaking out into our water and into our air. And one of the most radioactive buildings in the whole nuclear power and weapons complex is about to be demolished. It could be as soon as December. It could be into 2022. And so the action that we are currently asking for is for Governor Hochul and our New York State Assembly and senators to make sure that as it's being demolished, the Department of Energy puts an enclosure over it to prevent the release of that intense radioactivity throughout the area. And it would blow all over Western New York up to Canada, could go the other way toward Pennsylvania, Ohio, because the wind blows all over. So we're calling for the enclosure during demolition and off-site real-time publicly reported monitoring of the air. We also want it of water, but right now we're calling for it on air, especially because they don't want to cover the building when it's being demolished. So there is I'm going to put in the chat again for those who've just joined, a link that you can go to, and it will send a letter to, you can click on it. If you take the action, it will ask Governor Hochul and your Assembly and Senate person to do those two things. And we will be asking for more over the months and years to come, because this is a huge step in the West Valley cleanup process. But It's by no means all of it, but it's a big deal, and we want to make sure it's done as well as possible.
Right. So when the plant started in 64, was it 1964?
The burial started in the burial grounds. It was from 1 second here. The burial was from the early 60s, like 63 to 75. And the reprocessing and the big reprocessing building of the high level irradiated fuel, the hottest part of the fuel chain, it started coming in and it was chopped up and reprocessed from 66 to 72.
So it's important, I think, for people to know that the process is the same to develop nuclear energy as it is to develop nuclear weapons. One of the myths, that to get people to agree to this whole industry, agree with this industry, is kind of getting people to think they're like we're doing two separate things. But actually, it's the same process, and they're just different steps, right, Diane? They're one step.
Yeah, the mining and the milling and the concentration of the uranium-235 and the making of fuel assemblies. It's different for the reactors, the power reactors and the weapons reactors, but it's the same idea. You take uranium out of the ground, they grind it up and extract as much of the uranium-235 from the 238 and all the other uraniums and the other elements. And then they make fuel and they put it in the core of a reactor. And then in the power reactors, they want to split those uraniums, and the binding energy heats the water and turns the turbines and makes electricity and waste. Because when the atoms split, they form other radioactive elements. And in the weapons production, the uraniums absorb neutrons and form plutonium, but they still have radiated fuel. They have all kinds of radioactive elements that form and that last. Some of them. Sorry.
Yeah. So
they last for millions of years. The waste. Sorry.
Right. So when we were first introduced to the Japanese, they were strictly no more war because of the dropping of the bombs, the hydrogen atomic bombs. And they have a conference every year in Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. The bombs were dropped in Hiroshima on August 6th.
Yep, August 6th and August 9th.
Yeah, 9th at the end of the war. But it really wasn't. Now that's another myth, because it really wasn't the end. It was really the beginning of this nuclear arms race that we're still involved in, and people are still walking and talking and trying to get support to really, reel it all back in, because the genie was out of the bottle, and it's just turned into a very disaster, not only in terms of weapons, nuclear weapons, and I'm sure you hear this on the news, with the international news and which countries have nuclear weapons, but with the nuclear development issues and the nuclear plants that were originally built back in that era that are now beginning to age out, and the needs to contain the radiation, the nuclear radiation, and to make sure that the public is safe, has become every day that goes by, it becomes a greater issue. For us on my reservation, my mother's family owns property at the mouth of the Cattaraugus Creek. the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation is south of West Valley. So when the plant was put there, was put in West Valley and next to this town called Springville. And there's a reason why they call it Springville, because it's just very porous region. And there's a lot of these underground waterways that all pour, that are a part of the watershed for Lake Erie, and pour, water constantly into creeks like Buttermilk and what's the other creek that's at West Valley, Diane?
There's a bunch of little creeks and streams that cut through the land where the waste is buried. There's a north and south plateau, and then those streams drain into the Buttermilk that drain into the Cattaraugus, which then gushes into Lake Erie.
Right. And whenever we have a large storm, whenever it rains, the water goes in, from the sky, goes into the earth, and it carries all of that nuclear material into these streams, and then those streams empty into the Cattaraugus Creek, and then it comes down the Cattaraugus Creek. In Gowanda, we also had a Peter Cooper facility that was putting tannery waste into the creek for years and years and years. So there were many concerns about that, and that was finally shut down. But it's very difficult for us to kind of separate the toxics because of that issue as well. But over all these years that whenever it rains and that water comes down in that creek, it's been every day, bringing the nucleides down into the water and disposing them throughout the basin of the creek. Now the creek itself, because the nucleides are heavier, they tend to pool. And and the creek changes, so then it'll stay in certain areas. And then one of the major industries of our neighbors has been gravel mining. So they've been gravel mining in the creek, and every time they go in and where the water used to come in, and there's all this gravel, so they go in to dig up the gravel. They're also digging up all those nucleides, and then they're hauling them off and selling them to people all over Western New York. So not only, is that those nucleides being spread by the water, they're also being spread by these other gravel mining industries and being spread across Western New York. The other concern is any emissions into the air, because there has been, and they like to call it background radiation. There's been some monitoring done on our territory, and we found just, within the last 5-10 years, hotspots, and those have been attributed to, say, like the nuclear bomb, that was dropped, the bombs that were dropped in Nagasaki, Hiroshima, or the bombs that were tested. They were originally tested in Nevada on Indian land. The Paiutes and many of the native indigenous people.
Western Shoshone.
The Western Shoshone, mounted campaigns and tried to stop, because again, all of that was done on their lands, their ancestral lands, without prior free and informed consent. And of course, to no avail, because there's always that argument about, oh, this is going to be for the public good. Well, it is not good for the public to have nucleides in our water, in our air. So, these are the things that we've tried to educate people about, that this industry is not necessarily a good thing, for humans. It might be good for, making some electricity and that, but it's definitely not clean energy. But it's being, that's the other myth. I think we've talked about 3 myths so far. That's the third myth too, that nuclear energy is clean energy, and how people have been lulled to inactivity and lulled to sleep about nuclear because, that's for the public good. Well, it's not. We're facing huge issues of monies needed for containment, for cleanup, for containment, and to really stop this. Every time they touch something, it just spreads exponentially, out more and more every time they deal with it. So, it's really about, can we stop doing this? Is it time to stop yet? That's the question. And in our community, we have very high rates of cancer. The Cattaraugus Creek floods regularly because most of us live within the floodplain on our reservation territory. And we, just the health issues that we suffer from, just seem to go on and on and on, and without relief in sight. So there's a lot of issues that we're dealing with here, and we'd like to let people know, because we're very invisible in this society. We're such a small community that whenever we did do studies, then they would say, well, that's not a valid study because it's not large enough, so we might have come up with some data and some scientific information that showed, the bad effects of the nucleides on our people, but it was always discarded because we're a minority of the minorities. Our population are too small to be significant in any way. So it's a real word game, mindset, about doing something that harms somebody else and justifying it, rationalizing it for the common good, because we need so much electricity to keep the lights on in New York City, then, well, we've got to have all of this nuclear going on here. So, these are a lot of our concerns. We're struggling to improve our health status. We're struggling to clean up our community. On my mother's property, it floods down there, up to 4 or 5 feet twice a year. And every year, the people that rent the cottages along the creek at the mouth, they come in with their shovels and they dig that all out. And that's not really good for them either, because a lot of them don't have very much longevity because they end up getting sick and paying, paying for that development so people can turn the lights on in New York City. So, this is one of the concerns, are we, cutting off our nose to spite our face by continuing this type of industry? And it's not clean now with the climate change. What's being toted out there by the nuclear industrialists is spending more and more money on more nuclear development. nuclear. We need to spend more money on cleanup, but it doesn't seem to get trickle down that far. But everybody wants, well, we'll just make another one. We'll make a new one, and we won't have to worry about it anymore. They're not thinking about all of these aging nuclear facilities. Indian Point on the Hudson River is another one that's huge concern of the amount that's being spewed into the Hudson River, and its toxicity to the fish and to the people. And where does it end?
Something about Indian Point and West Valley, what we have in common is both of these sites in New York are closed. Indian Point, 3 nuclear power units closed. And so New York is undergoing major nuclear closure and demolition. The 4 reactors above, the one above Rochester at Gannett and the ones in Oswego, those 3 are still operating, but the Indian Point ones are closed, and they're looking at demolishing them. And we're looking at demolition of this big reprocessing facility at West Valley. And New York really does need to assert its authority over what's going on there and make sure that we have adequate monitoring. And states do have quite a bit of control, but it's not clear that New York is asserting it. So that's something else that we want to push for is oversight, and New York making sure that as these facilities are dismantled and demolished, that it doesn't spread all over the place.
So that's part of the message here today that we're trying to get out to people when we're asking you to write to the state. Diane, when we're talking about the authority, who actually owns the facility at West Valley?
So the West Valley nuclear site is owned by the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, which is not really an agency, it's an authority of New York State, but it still means that those of us who pay New York taxes are paying for, it's ours. And in the long run, we have liability over it. However, in 1980, a law passed that pulls in the Federal Department of Energy to clean up the reprocessing part, not the burial ground that New York licensed, but at least the reprocessing part. So New York in the long run owns it, but the Department of Energy is in there cleaning up a huge part of it. In one way or the other, our state or federal tax dollars are taking care of this facility, which was originally supposed to be for commercial nuclear power, but it actually reprocessed nuclear power and weapons waste. Like you said earlier, it's a mix. So we've got weapons and commercial waste all mixed there, and it needs to be watched pretty much forever, and it's eroding and it needs to be dug up. And as the building's demolished, we need to make sure that there's adequate monitoring and enclosure.
So the original nuclear fuel services,
Yeah,
who they actually were going to be the commercial plant. They were the commercial plant, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
They operated the site. Nuclear Fuel Services got a federal license from the Atomic Energy Commission and then the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to reprocess the irradiated fuel from both nuclear power and weapons. So the reactors around the country at the time in the 60s and early 70s, they sent their waste to West Valley, and then West Valley was going to chop it. Nuclear Fuel Services chopped up some of it and dissolved it in chemicals and extracted uranium and plutonium that went to the Department of Energy and the weapons complex. It was never used to make new fuel for nuclear power. And so that was the nuclear power and weapons waste coming in with a federal license. And then the state of New York gave a license to Nuclear Fuel Services to bury nuclear waste. So there is the state licensed burial ground. It's 14 trenches, about 20 or 30 feet deep. And there's at least 14 pounds of plutonium, which is dangerous for 1/4 to 500,000 years, buried in those trenches. So we have state licensed trenches and federally licensed holes in the ground where some waste from reprocessing was buried. And we have those things at the site, which in the long run is a New York State owned property, but it was definitely federal nuclear activities that were hoping to get off the ground here, but actually didn't quite make it.
So even at one point, West Valley was the only place open taking waste, right?
It is the only place in the country, commercial place that reprocessed irradiated fuel or spent fuel, as it's called, the hottest part of the fuel chain. So West Valley was a commercial reprocessing run by Nuclear Fuel Services, but more than half of the fuel that came in happened to be from nuclear weapons reactors. So we have a mix of weapons and power fuel that got chopped up and dissolved and extracted. And then the waste that's at the site still is a result of both of those power and weapons.
So this is part of the concern and why we're doing these series now, because I know I didn't know about how dangerous it was, or even knew exactly what was there, who was responsible for it, and what were the safety measures they were taking to protect the public. All I knew really was that these nuclides are washing down these tributaries that go into the Cattaraugus Creek. And when there's heavy rains and flooding on my reservation, that water all just goes out. Because they're heavier, they end up being deposited in people's yards and basements and continue to stay there. So this, this is our issue. We're living in a pretty hot place.
So when the reprocessing was taking place from 1966 to 1972, the water in the Cattaraugus Creek was the most radioactive water in the country. But I, who lived downstream and drank water from Lake Erie, never knew. And certainly Agnes and her cousins and her siblings and everybody else, they didn't know that this was radioactive water that they were playing in and fishing in. And at that time, from 66 to 72, was when it was the most radioactive. That's when they were taking this hot fuel and chopping it up and dissolving it. And they had to do it by remote control because nobody could do it directly or they would have immediate death because it's so hot. So this stuff was going down into the streams at that time. Then when they stopped that, and after they stopped putting waste in the burial grounds, there is some radioactivity that's getting off the site. And recently they built a wall to try to filter the water before it goes into the creeks and take out some of the strontium, which goes to bones and muscle and causes bone cancer and leukemia. And so they're trying to filter that out. But the water now is not nearly as hot as it was back in those years, but there's no safe level. And the federal government has legal allowable, and the state government has legal allowable levels. So they could be letting radioactivity out. And when they demolish the building, they're gonna flush down the radioactivity to keep it from blowing in the air. And that water is gonna be potentially released. So it's not as hot as it was in those years. That's the major atrocity. But like any nuclear site, there's going to be routine releases, which are potentially legal. And So we're calling for monitoring, better monitoring and reporting to the public so we know. And when there is some big releases, we want to know when that happens, whether it's intentional or not.
Most of the accidents at these nuclear sites were really discovered and reported to the public by watchdog groups and regular citizens because the government doesn't routinely report or aren't accountable to the neighboring communities. So there's really no way that we know or are informed. And it's only by our own direct action that we're going to be able to know what is going into our body. So the things of most concern, of course, is that breathing in through our nose and ingesting is the worst is worser, I should say, because just being exposed is bad as well. But for us on our reservation, many of our people are under the poverty line. You know,
I'm
we
just
have,
listening to this because I hate to pass up any source of information.
Is 6 o'clock okay for dinner?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it hot
what is
over
that,
there?
We have somebody in New Mexico that's not muted, but she works on uranium mining issues. Laura, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Laura, for joining us. So what time is it? Maybe we could get a time
It's
check.
7 o'clock. We should maybe open it up so people can talk with us.
Right, yeah. There's many things that we weren't able to cover. And that's why we did this series, because a lot of the people that are working with us that are monitoring and doing this work and have done this work lifelong are have so much information that we need to really document that and carry that on. And also because we're aging out, you know, we're getting older. And no one's telling our young people, because you know it's foreseeable in the future that at West Valley they wanted to just cover it over and put some cows on it, you know, and you know it's foreseeable that you know years from now people could be you know drilling through there or whatever, and if there's no communication from generation to generation about these hazards to our health, then how are our future generations going to know that that's even there? You know, this could all go away, you know, and everybody could pretend it's not there, but it's still there. And much of this can be very long-lived. So I think maybe we should go to the chat and have people, anybody that's asked questions. And we kind of covered a few things, but not everything. And we do have, I think, one more or two more series, two more.
Oh, at least
monthly
2.
series.
We've got
Yeah.
potentially more than that, but we were going to do 6 to begin with, and we know of 2 more, and we may even go into 2022.
Right.
There is a question here. Oh, sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that with the series, they're on the 4th Tuesday of the month. And, you know, people can just kind of save that date if they want to hear more.
Yeah, so next month is going to be Barbara Warren, and the month after that is going to be, and she's with Citizen, CEC, Citizens Environmental Coalition, and Kathy McGoldrick. Oh, no. Next is
Pat Townsend.
Pat Townsend, and then Barb, and then the month after that, we've got more people lined up. So
Right.
The question that I see in the chat is, when the waste was buried, was it contained some way to prevent it from contaminating the soil?
There were many containers developed, but with any container, it only has a certain life. And then they liquefied the waste, the liquid waste, So, and then they made these containers, but the containers it's in now are still not even gonna last, I don't know how long it is.
So
Like
there's,
that,
yeah,
the retainer wall is only a like 25-year lifetime. So that there's got to be constant care, taking care, containing this radioactive material. And nobody seems to be focusing on that except, the public, us, who are experience the effects of it, and the negative effects of it. If you go to anybody, they pretty much think, well, nuclear is, a good thing, let's nuke that and nuke this and it'll be okay. But what we're finding out as more time goes on that, high levels of cancer and the public health is really affected.
so the short answer to the question about the buried waste, in the burial grounds are unlined soil trenches. And the boxes and wooden and cardboard boxes and drums could very well have decayed since 1963 when they first started burying them. So that is an issue with that burial ground. And then Agnes was talking about the high level liquid waste from reprocessing that went into underground tanks, and then they converted that into solid, and that's sitting in, out on the road in thick containers. And for both of these, the waste is going to last longer than the containers. And I need to do a shout out to support to thank the workers at that site, because they are working very hard to keep the New York State Energy Research Development Authority people are working really hard to keep the streams and the creeks from eroding into the trenches. They're rebuilding the area and doing major construction projects to keep the waste from leaking out. And then of course there are the burial holes that are 50 feet deep, and those have already had leaks. Again, though, they're not necessarily lined. They might have a little better containers, but not containers that last as long as the waste.
So there was some demolition, at Hanford, right? And they did have some problems there and some releases. And this is one thing that we're trying to really point to and say, well, what are we doing here at West Valley to make sure that doesn't happen again? And that's part of this campaign now, to really write the letter, get that regulation reestablished, because we're coming, the political era we were in was a deregulation era, and that's not good for anybody. This stuff really has to be regulated, and there has to be money put into these cleanups.
So we have another, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, do we answer that question?
Yeah. Well, there's another one. It says, I thought the nuclear waste was buried in glass caskets. Do you want to do that one, or do you want me to?
No, you can.
Okay, so when the waste was reprocessed, so the irradiated fuel came to the reprocessing facility, they chopped up, it's a 14-foot long pencil thin rods. There were a couple hundred of those per assembly. And so what happened at West Valley, and a couple hundred assemblies would be in the core of a reactor. So they sent assemblies, nuclear fuel assemblies, to West Valley, and then with remote control, remote chopping, they chopped up the assemblies, the rods, and then they dissolved them in chemicals and extracted uranium and plutonium. And then the liquid and sludge went into two huge underground tanks. And then the Department of Energy was brought in at the beginning of the 1980s to convert that high-level liquid into a solid, and they converted it into, they call them glass logs. And then those glass logs were put into shielded containers that are sitting out on the pad outside waiting for permanent disposal. That's a portion of the waste. So when you say that the waste is in glass, it's glassified into these containers that are stored, but there's all this other waste that was generated along the way. And some of it got buried in the ground in 50-foot deep holes or in the 20 to 30-foot deep trenches. And that waste is not glassified. That waste is in cardboard and boxes and metal drums. And it could eventually be dissolving and getting out at some point. So some is in glassified form, but there are other forms of waste at the site. And we have to be watchdogging the whole above ground and the below ground cleanup of the site, because the whole area is eventually going to erode into the Cattaraugus Creek and the Great Lakes. And other valleys in that area are going to do the same thing. This is a geological phenomenon that we can't fight. We got to get the waste out of there.
With the effects of climate change, there was just an international alarm. You know, they had all of these estimates of the temperature and the flooding and everything, you know, how it was, and, you know, made some projections. And we, for say like 2030, but we've actually met those. So the pace at which the climate change has accelerated is really much faster than people thought originally when it became an international issue. Now they're saying we've met all of that, you know, with all of the water and the temperature and everything. And the thing about West Valley is that it's such a porous area, you know, it all got squashed into those creeks and then down into the Cattaraugus. The Cattaraugus flows through our reservation, and then it goes into the Lake Erie, and then right around the corner, the Army Corps of Engineers put at the mouth of our creek, put a berm so that it steers that water towards Sturgeon Point, which is the water intake for Western New York. So, you know, this is a concern that everybody in Western New York and Erie County specifically that drink the Erie County water really need to be concerned about, because it's your drinking water that is being contaminated, you know, as we speak, and just continues to be contaminated by the nuclides that are coming down the creek. So, you know, is there any other questions in the chat?
Not in the chat that I see. Maybe Colleen sees.
I have a question.
Okay.
So I would just ask, I'm very interested in what you said, Agnes, about just as you're talking about the long periods of time and keeping that knowledge. And I know Linda Schneekloth has said, you know, there must need to be some kind of, you know, holder of that knowledge, a person even. And I was also thinking, you know, have we talked about or thought about or tried to get it maybe even into law that it should be put in maps that there is massive radioactive waste where there is, or radioactive materials, weapons, you know, facilities, you know, generators, so that people can't ignore it so easily. If it's on all our maps, when you're thinking of having a picnic right there, don't do it, because you're right next to a nuclear facility. You know, I'm just wondering if that might be something that could happen.
Well, I think, you know, in my presentation, when I brought up the policy of a national sacrifice area, it goes so much deeper into the thinking of first and world people, and that they don't feel connected to third and fourth world people, and or concerned about our well-being to even have that kind of, excuse me, have that kind of policy. It was just, and it has become in America a way of doing business, you know, always for the short term and never, you know, looking at the long term. And in our tradition, you know, we've been here for thousands of years. So, you know, we're supposed to look at every decision we make on a daily basis on how that's going to affect 7 generations from now. And I don't know too many people that even think about decisions they make on a daily basis and how it's even going to just affect their own children that are alive, much less, you know, the faces of children that are still coming towards us. So, you know, this is part of the problem of trying to get something done about this issue is where people are so habitual and stuck in these ways of domination and, well, we'll just do this now so we can get what we want and not think about, you know, the future or how it's going to affect other people besides us. So there needs to be kind of this self-reflection about all of this. You know, Trump was a perfect example of when he deregulated everything, which is part of why we're doing this now, because we're coming out of that deregulation era, and it's so important to regulate and make sure that the nuclides are contained and the public health is protected.
So Agnes, there's a question that says, once nuclear waste is made, is there any way to safely dispose of it, or is containment the only way to keep it from direct exposure?
You could take that one.
Well, so some nuclear waste is dangerous for literally millions of years. There's iodine. Oh, and then we'll go to Dr. Sandy Greer. I see your hand is up. The radioactivity, plutonium, it has a 24,000 year half-life. So you have to multiply by 10 or 20. So it's dangerous for 1/4 to 500,000 years. And then iodine 129, which is also comes from the West Valley site and from.
We're doing this radio show. Sorry.
Sorry about
So the irradiated fuel has the iodine 129, which is dangerous. It's got a 16 million year half-life, so it's dangerous for 160 to 320 million years. So really, we don't have even a geological formation, let alone materials that can isolate it. So we do have to do our best to recontainerize it, keep track of it, not let it out. And some people very much believe that a deep geologic repository is the best way to go, but it's not guaranteeing that it will be isolated. And so should I just, Dr. Sandy Greer has her hand up. You need to unmute Dr. Greer. Yeah.
Thank you very much. In terms of the deep geological repositories, or DGRs, they are still totally experimental. Globally, there is not a single operating DGR on this planet for high-level waste. And in Ontario, for 10 years, there's been a fight against 2 different DGRs. The first one was for low and intermediate level waste, which was stopped by a vote from Saugeen Ojibwe Nation in January of 2020, after several years. And a second proposed DGR is targeting high level waste from commercial nuclear reactors from across Canada, and adding to how Indigenous lands are considered to be sacrifice zones. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization also targets impoverished rural and remote communities in Canada, and most specifically in Ontario. And right now, 2 different communities are being targeted. One, a farming community in the county, Bruce County, in the municipality of South Bruce. And secondly, up in northwestern Ontario, the NWMO is negotiating with the town, which is miles away from the Crown land where the borehole drill tests are being done for this proposed DGR up there, surrounded by First Nation communities who are really not having sufficient input into what they feel about it. And so this needs to be like an ongoing dialogue that is more inclusive of the First Nation voices. And up in the north, it's much worse for the First Nations people because a lot of them don't have access to computers to participate in education about the lack of science behind this whole process. But what I wanted to do is I'm going to put my email address in the chat, because I find if I'm writing too much in chat, I'm not paying attention to what people are saying, which to me is much more important. But what I would like to put out to everyone as a question, reaching out for help, one of the things that I would like to gather further scientific research about is understanding how aquifers work and how the contamination, I fully believe, will happen because the science behind the containers is still being studied, and there is no guarantee. And in fact, I think it's humanly impossible to create containers that will not eventually corrode and fall apart underground. And after 300 years, according to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, there will be no more institutional oversight. And so to me, the DGRs should be stopped, full stop, because they're experimental. And I believe, as someone suggested earlier, the rolling stewardship activity is really the wisest. I don't know if the chat will be saved for people to reread at future, but the rolling stewardship process is about continually monitoring the contained waste above ground where it can be monitored 24/7 as it is today in Canada. So that needs to continue through across generations. But my question to everybody, if anyone knows of research being done, how I want to find the language and the scientific research about proving that, like, what will happen when radionuclides continue to be released into waterways and into groundwater and aquifers, and evidence that contamination has happened, because this is what I need to convince the whole region here in Midwestern Ontario, and also share up with Northern Ontario people that this DGR idea is just morally wrong and morally irresponsible, and it needs to be stopped. So thank you. If anybody has or could direct me to people doing that kind of research too, so that I can get help. I'm working with an organization of farmers called Protect Our Waterways, No Nuclear Waste in South Bruce. So I'm working with them all the time, trying to find science research for them. And I want to continue to do that. So if I think we all need to really share knowledge and information and experience together, and get journalists to write more stories, because in Canada, journalism is in crisis, and it's citizen activists who are writing letters to editors of newspapers because very few journalists are writing about this important issue. So thank you very much. And I'm going to put my email in chat. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think we can answer that, but we can certainly work with you to try to find people. And I see that Talia Boyd has her hand up.
Yes, thank you, Diane. Just real quickly, I really appreciated what John Whitney put in the question and the chat section as far as talking about the whole nuclear fuel chain, and how it's, there's that argument that it's green and clean, but oftentimes the fact that we leave out the whole nuclear fuel chain, especially the uranium mining and milling, which is very carbon intensive, right? Because it requires a lot of fossil fuels, everything from heavy equipment to the transportation of all of this material. But I also wanted to mention, since we're on the topic of waste, that there is no permanent repository anywhere in the world for high level waste, like one person mentioned earlier, but also the interim low level waste also is stored on site at a lot of these facilities, right? And now they're doing what's called alternate feed and sending these materials to the White Mesa Mill, which is an area where I work on, which is located in southeastern Utah, but it's the last operating conventional uranium mill in the country. And this is where they're sending a lot of this alternate feed, which is basically a lot of waste streams that come from military sites, uranium conversion plants, rare earth metals facilities. But now they're proposing waste from Estonia, the Baltic nation of Estonia, and also Japan. And so they're bringing in waste from all of these internationally now. And again, the transportation routes for a lot of these materials is being transported across major freeways, major railways, all across the nation. So, these are important points to make when we're talking about these things, and the fact that a lot of these communities are rural, a lot of these communities are indigenous. Around the globe, indigenous communities are inundated by uranium mining and uranium issues, right? So we know firsthand, we are on the front lines of these issues. And Dr. Greer, you asked if there's any research or studies going on. Well, look at Navajo Nation, where I'm from. We have over 520 abandoned uranium mines, and that's complements of the Cold War. And so, we're still fighting for cleanup and cumulative studies. And this is, again, us fighting the US government for accountability and transparency. But there are some studies. Again, we don't have cumulative studies, as opposed to other communities like 3 Mile Island, who were immediately recognized and serviced and provided all of these resources. We're still pleading for all of that stuff. So I also really like the message that I'm hearing as far as building solidarity across the board. This is important. And I also am a community organizer. I organized something called the Natives Perspective Teach-In Series last year, specifically on uranium and environmental justice. So this is something that I think is critical moving forward, is having these dialogues and including Indigenous people in these spaces, but also connecting with other impacted communities like the Santa Susana Field Lab in 26 miles north of LA, where it's a predominantly white community, but they are inundated with a lot of this waste, and they're fighting to this day to get a lot of that cleaned up. So it's really about having these conversations and building that solidarity, I think. So I really appreciate this time and space that you all are putting into this. And thank you, and shout out to Agnes Williams for leading and facilitating these conversations, and for all the great work that you've done. Thanks, folks.
Thank you. And, back when they're doing this in the mid-century, what we were doing is, I was in California, and we were trying to work with progressive movements that were in the Bay Area. I lived in Oakland, and we were trying to get Indian land struggle on progressive movements agenda. And, for the last 60 years, we've been still doing the same thing. And it's still the same thing, because if people support native land struggles and preservation and conservation in native territories, then they won't be able to come in and do all of this wholesale mining and milling and waste disposal, because we're going to be allied up. And we've been, that's really what it's been about, is getting people to support Indian land struggles. And, one of the things that we ask people to do is to know whose land you're on. Everybody's living here, you can all go back to Europe or go to wherever your ancestors came from. But for us, like for Seneca, and for us, this is our place in the world. And once we're gone, we have no place to go back to, which makes it even more important, for us as Seneca or Indigenous people to really, fight these issues, because this is our territories and these are our lives and our future. And so I just really thank you. I'm glad you're out there doing that work. And we do have information, the West Valley Action Network. We've set up our group. We are using the Nuclear Information and Service Resource Services website, and for the logistics of it. Maybe Diane, you could give out some information about how people can contact us and put information in there, how we can start do more networking.
So the link that I gave before is www.nirs.org/monitor West Valley. That's to send letters in. And then we have a web page that it's not totally as up to date as we would like. We'd love a volunteer who might be able to help us keep it up, but it's the West Valley Action Network website. Just double check. I think it's westvalley.action.org. Let me double check on that. And I don't know if it is exactly 7:30, so I don't know if we're going to be able to take the more questions or whether we're going to, I've had this at the beginning. Yeah, I will put it in the chat in a minute.
Okay, so one of the things, I just want to say, acknowledge everybody that came tonight. Thank you for bearing with all the talking. We try to break it up a little bit so that it's not so much just, me talking or someone, but I'm glad you came, and I hope that there's a couple things that you might think about more and decide to take some action. The name Nuclear Free Future, that's the campaign that Indigenous women initiated initiatives borrowed from the Japanese. It actually came from our friend June-san. She brought that up. And this last year, she's been walking all over New York State. She has a peace pagoda in Petersburg, which is over near Albany. And she's been here and been affiliated with us since the 70s, since the longest walk in 1978. So we're working, our campaign is a nuclear free future. And I'm with the Indigenous Women's Initiatives. I'm a Seneca from the Cattaraugus territory, which is downstream from West Valley, New York. And is there anything else we should include here, Colleen, as we wind up?
Just that we'll be sending out the recording of this talk by email. So as long as you are here, you registered, so we have your email and you'll be receiving the recording. It's also going to be posted on the Western New York Environmental Alliance Facebook page, so you can share it out there with anybody who might not have been able to come tonight. Okay. We'll also send out information about the next workshops by email.
Okay. And how much time do we have left with our?
-3 minutes.
Over.
Okay,
time.
Diane, do you want to close out for us?
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all the questions. The West Valley Action Network wants more people to help us out and work with you and your organizations, individuals. It is westvalley.action.org. And thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.